everybody, I'm Brian, and I wanted to talk to you today about a new way of connecting to Cosmos, keyless Cosmos connections. But before we talk about the new way, let's talk about how maybe you're already connecting to Cosmos today. So let's jump over into some code and take a look. This is just a simple little function app I have. Could be a web app or any other code where you want to interact with Cosmos. And you're likely using the Cosmos SDK and this Cosmos client class. The way this works, the most common way to use it is you need to provide it two pieces of information. You need to provide it the URL or the endpoint of the Cosmos DB that you're talking to, and the key for auth to access the client or to access the Cosmos. So you can provide these many ways. You could have these, maybe they're app settings. In my case, I've got them stored in Key Vault. Key Vault is good for storing secrets and secure stuff. So I've got my Cosmos key in there just to make things easy. So if we take a quick look at the database, we can see where this is coming from. I'll dive in here to my Cosmos DB. And the first thing you can see is here's that URL. That's the first parameter. And then the second parameter is the key. And in my case, it's this RKMW key. So those are the two pieces of information we're providing to it. And while we're in here real quick, I'll just show you, this is just a test little database. Got a little bit of data in here so we can see later that we're getting the right results. It's just got 3 items in here that we'll see later when we query. If I hop over to the Key Vault, that was the other half of this. I've got my 2 secrets in here, the URL and then the key. And we can see the key is in fact that same value, RKMW, that I saw in the Cosmos instance itself. So those are both being read from Key Vault and being passed into this Cosmos client instance, and then the SDK will take those and use those credentials when I'm querying against my database to provide access. So if we look at, I've already got this function app deployed. If I take a quick look at it here, it is here. We can see there, it read my 3 records that we saw in the database. So pretty simple, but it just shows that I was able to use the key to access the database and get my data. So that's great. That works. It's pretty good, but there's a few things that we can improve on about it. So a couple things to note here are, although I have the key in Key Vault, that means that it's stored in another place now. So the key itself comes from Cosmos DB, but then I've also got a separate copy of it in Key Vault. So that's one more secret I have to manage and one more thing I have to worry about. Also, it makes rotating the key a little bit more complicated. So if I wanted to rotate the key, my Cosmos DB key, I would actually have to do several steps. So I would come into my Cosmos DB. I'm currently using the primary key. So in order to do this without interrupting my service too much, I would have to rotate the secondary key, generate a new version, and then copy that into my Key Vault, restart my app in my case, because I'm only reading the secret at startup time, and then rotate the primary key and take that value, copy that into Key Vault, restart my app again, and then I would be up and running on the new rotated key. So that's several steps. It's kind of hard to automate, could provide room for human error, and also a little bit of downtime in there. I have to restart my app a couple times. So that's not perfect. But there is ways we can improve on this. And in fact, if you jump into the docs, you can see that it does talk about a way to use managed identity to connect to your Cosmos DB. But if you scroll down here a bit and see what it's actually doing in the meat of it, you can see it's calling this management.azure.com. These are the REST APIs that power all of Azure. And so it's actually, what it's doing is it's calling this API, and then it's calling into the Cosmos DB provider, and then it's calling the list keys function. And so what that does is it gets the key directly from the database. But if you look down here, it's the same Cosmos client that we were talking about before, still passing at the endpoint. And then instead of passing the key from Key Vault or app settings, it's just getting the key directly from that REST API call. So you're not really accessing it with managed identity, or you're not avoiding the use of the key. You're just getting the key directly from the database. So you did remove Key Vault. You took one thing out of the equation, which is an improvement. But you're still essentially using the same technique, just getting the key from a different spot. That does provide some improvements, though. So, for example, the key rotation that was more complicated with Key Vault, so a little easier now. So when this code runs, this call will get the key directly from the database. So even if you've rotated, it'll get the current one, and it'll pass that to this instance, and so you'll have the right one. So that is a little better. But it still is using the key and we want to avoid using the keys and avoid as many secrets as possible. So we're going to see if we can do a little better than that. So let's recap where we're at. So when we talked about so far, in order to connect to Cosmos at all, you have to know the key. And things like key vault are secure, but storing your key in there is just one more thing to manage, and makes things like key rotation complicated because you have to do that kind of 5-step dance to get the key rotated and updated and restarted. And even if you use the REST API approach to avoid some of that, you're still using the key. And the important part there is that the keys are kind of all or nothing. So if your key leaks out into the wild and someone has it, then any caller can use it. There's no any more fine-grained control than that. It's just if you have the secret, you can access the database. And so we want to try to improve upon that. So in fact, if you go back to that same document of the official docs, you can see up at the top, it's actually been updated to say that there's an even newer, better way to do this now. It's in this nice little green box, and it's called Data Plane Role-Based Access Control. And when you click into it, it's very thorough. It's got all kinds of information about how it works and all the operations you can do, but it's actually quite simple to actually implement in real life. So I'm going to show how to do that real quick. So in our function app, before we were providing the endpoint and the key, but if you look at this, the signatures here, you can see we're using the one that takes an auth key or resource token, but there's actually another overload that takes a token credential. And the easiest way to provide a token credential is new default Azure credential. And a default Azure credential is nice because it's smart. And so when you're running this locally, you're doing development on your local machine, it will use the credentials that you're logged into Visual Studio with or your Azure CLI. So I'm logged in with my account, and it will use that locally. But then when I deploy this code to Azure, it will automatically use the managed identity of the service. And so I don't have to have any if statement, this environment aware. It will just do the right thing in the different environments. So you can see here, we're still telling it where the Cosmos DB is, but instead of the key, we're just providing this credential. So we don't even have to use the key anymore. And so we can take a look at that. This is also deployed already. So before we had the query that was using the key for access, and now we'll use the one that's using the keyless access. There's an error. So this is actually expected because you can see here it says the request is blocked because the principal B471, etc., does not have the required RBAC permissions. So unlike key-based access, where simply having the key provided you the necessary credentials, this is role-based. So now we've enabled role-based access, but we didn't actually grant any permissions to anyone. So I need to grant access to my function app in order to be able to call into Cosmos DB using this approach. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this ID and then show how to do that. This is an important place to note that this is all fairly new, and so you can't do a lot of this via the portal UI. So normally you would go into the portal UI and click around and be able to configure some of this. But at the moment, you have to do this using command line tools. So you can use Azure CLI or PowerShell or ARM templates, a few different ways, but you can't do it visually in the portal quite yet. So let's hop back over here. I'm going to go ahead and kick this off, and then I'll come back here and explain what it's doing while it runs. So this is the new commands that are available to enable this. So there's this Cosmos DB SQL role assignment in the Azure CLI, and there's an equivalent for PowerShell. And what this is doing is you need to give it a few things to tell it where Cosmos DB is. You need to give it the subscription, the resource group name, and the name of the Cosmos DB you're connecting to. And then the important bits are who are you giving access to? That's this B47F that we just saw didn't have access. I want to grant my function app access. And the second important part is the role definition. And so there are two different roles that you can use, the 0001 role, which is read-only, or the 0002 role, which is read and write. And these are not like roles you might be familiar with in Azure. Like if you log into the portal and you're a contributor and you've got access to do certain things in the portal, those are called management plane access roles. Those give you access to create resources and manage resources. This is what's called a data plane access role. And so you can see this is not a unique GUID or anything. It's just a bunch of zeros. This is specific to Cosmos DB, and this is just for accessing the data within the instance versus the management plane roles that are for managing the instance itself. So it's important to note the difference between data plane access and management plane access. So hopefully this ran by now, and we'll see, not super important here other than to see that it ran, and when it's done, it kind of dumps out some information, essentially telling me that it did go ahead and grant this role to that principal. So if we switch back now to our test, we should see now that previously when we were blocked because we did not have the required RBAC permissions, now we're using the default Azure credential and we have granted access to this principal. So we should now be able to access our data. And we can see, in fact, we are. So there's those 3 records from the database. So that shows that we can access it just like before. I didn't change any code in how I access the database as far as running the query or anything, just in the way that I constructed the Cosmos client and the way the credentials were provided. And you can see that the key-based way, it still works as before. They both return the same data now. But if we go back to our code, we can see that we're not even using the key anymore. So we're using this default Azure credential. And so the key is not even required. So not only can we not use the key, we can also set up our Cosmos DB to not even allow the key to be used at all, which will make us even more secure. So again, you can't do this via the UI, but we'll go ahead and do this one. You can do this via an ARM template. So here's an example. This is a stripped down ARM template. This is the Cosmos DB resource. And then down here, the important property is this one, disable local auth. And so if I set that to true, that's going to tell Cosmos DB to not allow, they call it local auth, but that's essentially key-based auth. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And then I'll come back and go into a little more detail on that. Oops, that's my wrong screen. While that runs, I'll talk a little bit more about, since this isn't available via the portal, how you can tell what's going on. So if you go into your Cosmos DB and you scroll all the way down to the bottom and you export template, this will generate an ARM template that represents what's currently deployed in Azure. And there's a couple things you can see in here. So here's the Cosmos DB instance itself, and that property we were just talking about is in here, disable local auth. It's still set to false. Our ARM template deployment is still running. It hasn't finished, so this is still set to false. And then if you scroll down a little more, you can see a few other things in here. Here's those 2 role definitions. So here's the 001, the reader role, and here's the 002, the read-write role. And then below that a little bit more are the actual role assignments. So if you get down here a little bit farther, you can see here's the one we granted. So we granted the read-write 002 role to my function app, which was that B47F principal ID. So although you can't manage this via point and click UI in the portal, you can kind of indirectly see that it's working properly by exporting your ARM template and seeing the properties in there. So hopefully by now we can see that this ARM template has completed. It succeeded, so that's great. So if we hop back in here and just refresh this ARM template, we should see now that that disable local auth has now been changed. And in fact, it has, and now it's set to true. So that means that we've told Cosmos DB to not allow key-based access at all. And so what that should mean is when we go here to this query 2, which was the keyless RBAC-based access, oops. What it should mean here is that when you go back to here, this was our key-based access, that we can no longer access it. And the key here is that it says local authorization is disabled, and you need to use an AED token to authorize all requests. So this key-based access, it still had the right key, but the Cosmos DB itself is preventing it from accessing it. So even if your key leaked out into the wild, no one can use it. It's effectively unusable at this point. So let's talk about where that brings us. So we talked about why using a key might be problematic. And now we can talk about why using keyless might be better. So you don't need to store your key in Key Vault or in your app settings at all anymore. So it's one less secret to manage. That key rotation complexity is not only easier, it's completely removed. There's no key to even rotate, so you don't have to even worry about it. And like we saw, you can disable key access entirely so that even if your key did leak and some attacker got it, it's useless to them because you're not even allowing access via key at all anyway, only via role-based access. And then the important part of all that is that also gives you more fine-grained control. So you can grant access to one app. You might give them read access. You might give another app access for read and write. You might revoke it for someone else. Because it's role-based, you get a lot more fine-grained control, whereas the kind of key-based approach is if you have the key, you can access the database. So this gives you a lot more control. But with that there are some caveats to all of this. One of which is, I mentioned a few times, you can't manage this in the portal. So I did show you how you can export the ARM template and see kind of the effect of this. But in order to set this stuff up, you need to use command line-based tools. So on the next slide, I've got some links to resources. There's Azure CLI commands, there's PowerShell commands that you can use to do this stuff in the meantime. There is a plan to add this to the portal, so you can use it via the UI. But for today, you need to use the command line tools. Another important point to call out is that the Data Explorer in the Azure portal requires key-based access to function properly. And so what that means is if you hop into your Cosmos DB and you go into the Data Explorer, earlier we saw in here, this is where we saw the 3 records, and I try to view them. And now I get this red bang and I get this same error we saw earlier. Local authorization is disabled. So the Data Explorer in the portal itself uses key-based access to function properly. And so when it's disabled, it doesn't work anymore. That's not great, but there is a workaround. And in fact, the docs that we were reading just a moment ago do give us a tip down here at the bottom that says that you can use the Cosmos DB Data Explorer instead. Let's right down here a little bit farther. So this talks about how the portal doesn't support it yet, but you can use the Azure Cosmos DB Explorer instead, and it does support RBAC keyless connections. So you can still view your data and interact with it. You just can't do it right in the portal, which isn't perfect, but we'll get there. And then the last one to call out as far as caveats is that the Cosmos emulator also doesn't support RBAC. Because the emulator is a standalone thing, it doesn't know anything about Azure or accounts or roles. It still requires a key. So it has a well-known key that's published with the docs that you use to connect to it, and you need to keep doing that. So if you're using the emulator for your local development, or maybe you're using an integration test or your CI pipeline, you still need to use that well-known key. So you may have to have in your code something that detects your environment. If you're running in one of these test environments, use the well-known key. Otherwise, you can use the default Azure credential and connect with a keyless approach. So here's a couple links to those things we were talking about. The first one is that document that kind of goes into more depth about all the different roles, the role assignments, what each of the permissions that each grants, and how to run it all. The second 2 here talk about the Azure CLI commands and the PowerShell commands that we were using. So there's documentation. They're all fully documented. Here's the Azure CLI ones. I was using the create command earlier and giving it the resource group and the subscription ID and the principal that I wanted to grant it. You can also delete, list, show. There's a few other things you can do. And then there's also the same corresponding commands for PowerShell. You can do all the same stuff with granting and listing all the role definitions. So that's how you can do it in the meantime when you need to use command line tools until the portal is updated. And then the last one, link here, talks about kind of managed identity in general, the concept. We didn't go deep on managed identity, but that's kind of the basis for how all this RBAC stuff works, is in order to grant a role-based access to someone, we need to know who that someone is. So in my case, it was a function app, could have been a VM, web app, anything. Managed identity is the kind of concept that underpins all of that. So we can tell who is this Azure service that I want to grant access to. So we talked a little bit about how you connect today, how you can use this new feature to connect and remove secrets. And so now you all know how to use keyless Cosmos connections to connect to your database as well. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.